The crack of Hunter's palm across my face echoed through our kitchen like a gunshot, and our 6-year-old twins, Emma and Jeffrey, dropped their cereal spoons in stunned silence. As I steadied myself against the granite countertop, tasting blood, from my split lip something unexpected happened. I smiled, not a trembling, broken smile of a beaten wife, but a slow, knowing smile that made Hunter's confident smirk falter as he realized he had just given me exactly what I needed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light filtered through our floor-to-ceiling windows in our Connecticut estate, casting long shadows across the pristine marble floors that would soon be stained with more than just spilled orange juice. I had been waiting 3 years for this moment. 3 years of careful documentation, strategic planning, and building an unshakable case. Hunter Whitmore, heir to the Witmore pharmaceutical empire and my husband of 8 years, had finally crossed the line I needed him to cross. Emma and Jeffrey sat frozen at the breakfast island, their identical brown eyes, so much like mine, wide with shock and confusion. At 6 years old, they had never witnessed their father's violence before. I had made sure of that. Every previous incident had been carefully private, timed when they were at school or staying with my sister. But this morning was different. This morning, I had orchestrated the perfect storm. Mommy? Emma's voice was barely a whisper, her small hand reaching toward my reddening cheek. Why did Daddy hurt you? Hunter's face flushed with embarrassment and rage. In his world, the world of board meetings and country clubs, of charity galas and political fundraisers, men like him didn't lose control in front of witnesses, especially not their own children. His perfectly groomed appearance, the custom-tailored suit that cost more than most people's monthly salary, the practiced charm that had fooled everyone from federal regulators to Fortune 500 CEOs, It cracked in that moment. Your mother is being dramatic, he said, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. He straightened his tie with hands that trembled slightly, the same hands that had been signing fraudulent research reports and authorizing deadly drug trials for the past 5 years. She fell, clumsy as usual, but Emma and Jeffrey weren't. Stupid. They had seen what they had seen. And more importantly, so had the hidden cameras I had installed throughout our home over the past 6 months. Cameras that were currently live streaming to a secure server monitored by federal investigators. I dabbed at my lip with a cloth napkin, the white linen blooming red like a flower. 3 years of playing the perfect pharmaceutical heiress wife had led to this moment. 3 years of charity boards and society events, of smiling while Hunter and his family systematically poisoned children with untested medications to pad their quarterly profits. 3 years of documenting every forged signature, every bribed official, every covered-up death. It's okay, sweetheart, I told Emma, my voice steady despite the throbbing in my jaw. Sometimes people show us who they really are when they think no one important is watching. Hunter's eyes narrowed. He didn't understand yet that everyone important was watching. The twins, yes, but also FBI agent Porter Reed, who was receiving real-time footage from the cameras. Dr. Constance Cooper, the whistleblower pediatric oncologist who had been documenting the children dying from Whitmore's deliberately contaminated chemotherapy drugs. And Senator Ted Whitmore, Hunter's own uncle, who had agreed to testify against the family in exchange for immunity when I had presented him with evidence of his own complicity 3 months ago. The kitchen fell silent, except for the gentle hum of the coffee machine and the soft ticking of the antique clock, a wedding gift from Hunter's grandmother, another Whitmore who had built the family fortune on other people's suffering. Every detail of this morning had been calculated, from the timing of Hunter's arrival home from his business trip to Singapore, actually a money laundering operation, to the specific words I had chosen to trigger his explosive temper. You think you're so smart, Hunter said, stepping closer, his voice dropping to the dangerous whisper I had learned to fear over the years. You think you can manipulate me? You think you understand how this family works? I stood slowly, maintaining eye contact, letting him see the absence of fear in my expression. For 3 years, I had been Dr. Helen Whitmore, devoted wife and mother, graduate of Johns Hopkins Medical School, who had chosen family over career. What Hunter didn't know was that I had never stopped being Dr. Helen Reed, forensic accountant, and former FDA investigator, the woman who had built her reputation destroying pharmaceutical companies that prioritized profits over patients. I think, I said quietly, aware that every word was being recorded, that our children deserve to understand the difference between right and wrong, even when the people who are supposed to protect them are the ones causing the harm. Hunter's hand rose again, an automatic response to defiance, and I saw Emma flinch. That reaction, that split second of terror in my daughter's eyes, solidified my resolve in a way that 3 years of documentation and evidence gathering never could. This wasn't just about justice anymore. This was about ensuring that Emma and Jeffrey would never grow up thinking that power meant the right to hurt others. "Daddy, stop!" Jeffrey's voice cut through the tension, high and frightened. "You're scaring Emma!" The sound of his son's voice seemed to penetrate Hunter's rage, and his hand slowly lowered. But the damage was done. Not just the physical evidence of his violence, the mark on my face that would photograph beautifully for the restraining order, but the psychological evidence. 2 6-year-old witnesses who would never again see their father as a hero. I picked up my phone from the counter, a gesture that appeared casual, but was actually the final trigger in a sequence I had programmed months ago. With one swipe, the video evidence from this morning would be automatically distributed to law enforcement, media outlets, and regulatory agencies across 3 countries. The Whitmore Empire, built on 90 years of medical fraud and regulatory capture, was about to face its reckoning. "Emma, Jeffrey," I said, my voice calm and gentle. "Would you like to help Mommy pack some suitcases? We're going to stay with Aunt Amelia for a while." As the twins slid down from their chairs, still confused but trusting in my composure, Hunter finally understood that something fundamental had shifted. The woman he had been controlling and manipulating for 8 years was gone, replaced by someone who had been planning this moment longer than he could imagine. The morning sun continued to stream through our windows, illuminating a house that would soon be seized by federal agents, casting light on a family that would soon be torn apart by truth, and revealing a woman who had just ensured that justice would finally find the Whitmore family. And it all started with a slap that Hunter thought would silence me forever, but instead became the sound that would bring down everything he had ever built. 6 months earlier, my life looked like a magazine spread. Every morning at precisely 6:30 a.m., I would wake in our master suite overlooking the manicured gardens of our Fairfield County estate, slip into designer athleisure, and begin the carefully choreographed routine that defined Mrs. Hunter Whitmore's existence. The reflection staring back at me from the bathroom mirror was everything Hunter's family had ordered. Blonde highlights touching up monthly at the most exclusive salon in Greenwich, skin maintained through weekly facials and quarterly eye procedures, body sculpted by a personal trainer who cost more than most people's annual salaries. I was 34 years old and looked 28, thanks to a dermatologist who specialized in keeping pharmaceutical heiresses camera-ready for charity events. Hunter would emerge from his walk-in closet at exactly 7:15, already dressed in one of his 40 identical navy suits, each custom-tailored in London and costing more than a new car. His morning routine was as mechanically precise as a Swiss watch: coffee black, no sugar, exactly 2 pieces of whole grain toast with a thin layer of organic almond butter. He would scan his phone while eating, occasionally making dismissive sounds at whatever headlines caught his attention. "The FDA is being unreasonable again," he would mutter, not really speaking to me but performing the role of the concerned pharmaceutical executive. "They want another 6 months of trials for the pediatric leukemia drug. Children are dying while they demand unnecessary paperwork." I would nod sympathetically, playing my part perfectly. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. What Hunter didn't know was that I had already read the same headlines and the confidential reports that never made it to the press. Those 6 months of trials he complained about, they were needed because the previous trials had been completely fabricated. Children weren't dying from bureaucratic delays. They were dying from Whitmore Pharmaceutical's deliberately poisoned medications. The twins would join us at 7:30, dressed in their expensive private school uniforms, chattering about playground politics and upcoming tests. Emma was reading at a 4th grade level despite being only 6, while Jeffrey had already shown remarkable aptitude for mathematics. They were bright, curious children who asked questions that pierced through adult deceptions with uncomfortable accuracy. "Daddy, why do some kids at school get sicker after taking medicine?" Emma had asked one morning, her innocent brown eyes fixed on Hunter's face. Hunter's fork had paused halfway to his mouth. "Medicine always makes people better, sweetheart. Those children were probably already very sick." But I knew better. Emma was talking about the children in the special program at her elite private school. Children whose families had been selected to receive experimental treatments from Witmore Pharmaceuticals. Children who were being used as unknowing test subjects for drugs that hadn't passed safety trials. Children whose deteriorating health was being carefully documented by company researchers, while their parents were told they were receiving cutting-edge care. Our breakfast conversations were performed theater, each of us playing roles written by someone else. Hunter, the dedicated pharmaceutical executive working tirelessly to save lives. Me, the supportive wife who had sacrificed her own medical career to raise their perfect family. The twins, precious accessories to our carefully crafted public image. After breakfast, I would drive the children to Whitmore Academy, the private school founded by Hunter's great-grandfather and funded through a charitable foundation that was actually a money-laundering operation. The school itself was legitimate, filled with brilliant teachers and exceptional students, but its funding came from profits made by poisoning other children. The irony was never lost on me as I watched Emma and Jeffrey receive the best education money could buy, paid for with blood money. Returning home, I would begin my official duties as a Whitmore wife. Phone calls to coordinate charity events, meetings with interior designers to maintain our showplace home, appointments with personal shoppers to ensure my wardrobe met family standards. Every aspect of my day was designed to reinforce the image of Witmore Pharmaceuticals as a company led by good people who cared about families. The estate itself was a masterpiece of careful presentation. 47 acres of perfectly maintained grounds, featuring a tennis court where I took lessons I didn't need, a pool where I swam laps in designer swimwear, and gardens where I posed for society photographers during charity events. The house had been featured in Architectural Digest twice, presented as the home of a family dedicated to both luxury and service. What the magazines didn't show were the spaces I had claimed for myself. The small office adjacent to my walk-in closet, officially designated for managing household staff and charitable commitments. The basement wine cellar, where among bottles were thousands of dollars, I had installed a sophisticated computer system hidden behind false walls. The garden shed, innocuous and rarely visited, where I maintained equipment for testing pharmaceutical samples stolen from Hunter's briefcase. My afternoons were filled with the performance of privilege. Lunch at the country club with other pharmaceutical wives, our conversations carefully monitored and reported back to our husbands. Shopping expeditions to Manhattan, where every purchase was tracked and analyzed for appropriateness. Spa appointments where relaxation was really reconnaissance, gathering intelligence from other wealthy wives whose husbands worked in related industries. The most elaborate performances came during dinner parties and charity galas. I would wear gowns that cost more than most people's monthly salaries, jewelry that had been in the Whitmore family for generations, and a smile that never faltered even when listening to Hunter give speeches about his company's commitment to children's health. I learned to nod appreciatively when other pharmaceutical executives joked about overly cautious regulators, to laugh politely when politicians made comments about the business of medicine, and to remain composed when testimonials from grateful patients were actually paid actors reading scripts. But perhaps the most challenging performance was in our private moments. Hunter expected a wife who was beautiful, available, and completely uninterested in the details of his work. He wanted someone who would listen to his complaints about regulatory oversight without asking informed questions, who would support his business decisions without understanding their implications, who would represent the family at social events, without ever investigating what that family actually did. For 3 years, I gave him exactly what he wanted while secretly becoming the person he feared most. An expert investigator who understood pharmaceutical fraud better than anyone in federal law enforcement. Every charity event became an intelligence-gathering operation. Every social lunch provided opportunities to cross-reference information. Every intimate conversation with Hunter was recorded and analyzed for evidence of criminal activity. The most difficult part wasn't maintaining the facade. It was watching my children grow up surrounded by the wealth built on other children's suffering. Emma and Jeffrey were developing the casual entitlement that came with extreme privilege, never questioning why they had access to opportunities that others didn't. They were learning that the Whitmore name opened doors and silenced questions, that their family was special in ways that didn't need explanation. Hunter had never hit me during those 3 years of investigation. His control was more sophisticated. Psychological manipulation designed to keep me compliant and isolated. He would praise my appearance while subtly criticizing my intelligence. He would encourage my charitable work while limiting my access to family finances. He would present himself as a protective husband while systematically cutting me off from friendships and professional connections that might challenge his authority. The violence had always been there, lurking beneath his polished exterior, but it was emotional and economic rather than physical. Until the morning when everything changed, when my careful investigation finally gathered enough evidence to threaten not just Hunter, but the entire Whitmore pharmaceutical empire. That was when desperation made him careless, when his need to maintain control finally drove him to cross the line I had been waiting for him to cross. Because sometimes, the only way to expose a monster is to let them reveal themselves completely. The afternoon of that final confrontation, after I had taken Emma and Jeffrey to my sister Amelia's house and ensured they were safe, I returned to our estate for the last time as Mrs. Hunter Whitmore. But instead of packing clothes or gathering sentimental items, I went directly to the one place in our 47-acre property that Hunter had never discovered: my real office. Hidden beneath the floorboards of what appeared to be a storage closet in our wine cellar, accessible only through a biometric scanner disguised as a vintage wine opener, lay 3 years of the most comprehensive pharmaceutical fraud investigation ever assembled by a private citizen. As the concealed panel slid open with a whisper-quiet hydraulic system, I descended into what I privately called my war room. The space itself was small, roughly 8 feet by 12 feet, but every inch was utilized with surgical precision. Professional-grade servers hummed quietly in climate-controlled housing, their LED status lights casting an eerie blue glow across walls lined with evidence that would destroy one of America's largest pharmaceutical companies. Multiple monitors displayed real-time data feeds from sources across 3 continents, tracking everything from offshore banking transactions to clinical trial falsifications to regulatory bribery schemes. This was where Dr. Helen Reed had been, living her real life for the past 3 years, even as Helen Whitmore performed her role upstairs. Every evening, after Hunter fell asleep aided by the sleeping medication I had been secretly replacing with harmless placebos, I would slip down here to continue building the case that would bring justice for the thousands of children whose lives had been destroyed by Whitmore Pharmaceuticals. The central server contained over 2 terabytes of evidence, meticulously organized and cross-referenced. Bank records showing payments to corrupt FDA officials, with amounts ranging from $50,000 to $2 million. Video recordings of board meetings where executives laughed about acceptable mortality rates in pediatric populations. Audio files of Hunter's private phone calls with foreign government officials, arranging for experimental drugs to be tested on orphaned children in countries with no regulatory oversight. One wall was dedicated to what I called the victim board, photographs, and medical records of 847 children who had died or suffered permanent damage from Whitmore medications over the past 5 years. Each photo was accompanied by detailed documentation, original medical conditions, prescribed Whitmore treatments, documented side effects, final outcomes. The youngest victim was 3 years old. The oldest was 15. All of them had trusted that the medicine designed to heal them wouldn't be their instrument of death. At the center of the wall was a photograph that had driven my investigation from the beginning. 7-year-old Marcus Chen, who had died from liver failure after receiving Whitmore's revolutionary pediatric cancer treatment. Marcus had been Emma's classmate at Whitmore Academy before his family was selected for the experimental drug program. I had watched him deteriorate over 6 months, his parents so grateful for the cutting-edge treatment that they never questioned why their son was getting sicker instead of better. Marcus's death had been the moment I understood that the Whitmore family wasn't just guilty of corporate greed, they were guilty of systematic murder. And Marcus wasn't an isolated case. He was part of a pattern that stretched back decades, hidden behind charitable foundations and medical research grants. The evidence collection had required skills I had developed during my previous career as an FDA investigator, before I met Hunter, and was gradually manipulated into abandoning my professional life. Corporate surveillance techniques, forensic accounting, digital infiltration, all the tools I had once used to prosecute pharmaceutical fraud were now being employed against my own husband's family. Every piece of evidence had been obtained through legal means, though some required creative interpretation of marital property laws. Hunter's briefcase contents, photographed and returned before he noticed. Financial documents left in our shared home office, digitally copied during late-night sessions. Recordings of conversations in our own house, where I had every legal right to document what was said. Phone calls made from our landline, which I co-owned as a spouse. The most damaging evidence came from Hunter's own computers. As his wife, I had legitimate access to our shared home network, and Hunter's arrogance had led him to store incriminating files on insecure personal devices. Corporate emails detailing bribery schemes, financial spreadsheets showing money laundering operations, video conferences with international criminal organizations that purchased untested drugs for use on vulnerable populations. But perhaps the most crucial evidence was biological. Samples of the contaminated medications themselves. Using equipment I had installed in our garden shed under the guise of creating an organic chemistry lab for hobby research, I had been testing every medication that passed through our house. The results were horrifying. Medications supposed to treat childhood leukemia were deliberately contaminated with compounds that would cause liver failure. Antibiotics designed for infant use contained toxins that would damage developing nervous systems. Pain relievers for pediatric patients included substances that would create permanent heart damage. Each contaminated sample was documented with chain-of-custody protocols that would satisfy any court in the world. I had learned from my FDA career that evidence was worthless without proper documentation, so every test was recorded, witnessed by my hidden cameras, and stored in multiple locations with timestamps and digital signatures. The investigation had also revealed the scope of the Whitmore family's influence. Senator Ted Whitmore wasn't just Hunter's uncle. He was the architect of legislation that had removed safety requirements for pediatric drug testing. Federal Judge Constance Whitmore Cooper wasn't just a distant cousin. She was the primary judge hearing cases against pharmaceutical companies, ensuring that lawsuits against Whitmore never succeeded. Dr. Porter Whitmore wasn't just Hunter's brother. He was the chief of pediatric oncology at 3 major hospitals, steering families toward Whitmore's experimental programs. The family had spent 90 years building a network of influence that allowed them to poison children with complete impunity. Politicians they had purchased, judges they had installed, doctors they had trained, journalists they had bought, all working together to ensure that Witmore Pharmaceuticals could conduct any experiment they chose on any vulnerable population they targeted. As I reviewed the evidence one final time before transmitting it to authorities, I found myself thinking about Emma and Jeffrey sleeping safely at their aunt's house. They would wake up tomorrow in a world where their father was no longer a respected businessman, but a wanted criminal. Their trust funds, built on blood money, would be seized. Their elite private school, funded by pharmaceutical fraud, would be shuttered. Their extended family, exposed as international criminals, would be imprisoned or fleeing the country. But they would also wake up in a world where justice was possible, where powerful people could be held accountable for their crimes, where their mother had chosen truth over comfort. They would learn that courage sometimes meant destroying everything you had built in order to save something more important: the lives of children they had never met, the integrity of medical research, the possibility that medicine could heal rather than harm. The final piece of evidence I added to the transmission was the recording from that morning's breakfast. Hunter's slap captured in high-definition video from 3 different angles, with crystal-clear audio of his threats and our children's terrified responses. It was the perfect capstone to 3 years of documentation, a moment when his mask slipped completely, revealing the violence that had always lurked beneath his polished exterior. As I initiated the final transmission sequence, sending 2.3 terabytes of evidence simultaneously to the FBI, FDA, DEA, SEC, and investigative journalists at 5 major news organizations, I felt a profound sense of completion. The woman who had entered this hidden room 3 years ago as a desperate wife trying to understand her husband's business was leaving as the architect of the largest pharmaceutical fraud prosecution in American history. The Whitmore empire had been built on the corpses of children. Tomorrow, it would begin crumbling under the weight of truth, and Emma and Jeffrey would grow up knowing that their mother had chosen justice over everything else in the world. The moment that changed everything happened on a Tuesday afternoon in March, 3 years before Hunter's hand ever connected with my face. I was in our home office, supposedly organizing charity auction items for the annual Whitmore Foundation Gala, when Hunter's briefcase fell open after he knocked it off his desk in frustration over a phone call. Papers scattered across the hardwood floor, and as I knelt to help gather them, one document caught my eye: a clinical trial report with Marcus Chen's name at the top. I knew Marcus. He was Emma's friend from school, a bright 7-year-old who had been diagnosed with acute lymphoblastic leukemia 6 months earlier. His parents, Dr. Amy Chen and Professor Robert Chen, had been so grateful when Witmore Pharmaceuticals selected Marcus for their experimental treatment program, but the numbers on this report didn't match what the Chens had been told. According to the document in my hands, Marcus wasn't receiving cutting-edge leukemia treatment. He was being given deliberately modified doses of an experimental drug that had failed safety trials in adult populations. The report detailed acceptable mortality projections and anticipated liver failure timelines, as if Marcus's death was not just expected, but planned. My hands trembling, I photographed the document with my phone before Hunter could notice. That single page of cold clinical calculations about a child's deliberate poisoning became the first piece of evidence in what would become the largest pharmaceutical fraud case in American history. Over the following weeks, I couldn't stop thinking about Marcus. I began paying closer attention to the children at Whitmore Academy who were receiving experimental treatments through the family's charitable programs. Emma would come home with stories about classmates who were getting sicker instead of better, parents who were told that deterioration was part of the healing process, families who were so grateful for the opportunity that they never questioned why elite medical care seemed to be making their children worse. My background as an FDA investigator had taught me to recognize patterns, and the pattern here was unmistakable. Whitmore Pharmaceuticals was using charitable programs to conduct illegal human experimentation on children, targeting families who were too grateful, too trusting, or too desperate to ask critical questions. The second revelation came during a dinner party at our house in April. Hunter was entertaining a group of pharmaceutical executives, and I was playing my role as the perfect hostess when I overheard a conversation between Hunter and Dr. Porter Reed, the chief of pediatric oncology at Connecticut Children's Medical Center. "The new batch of subjects for the leukemia trial are perfect," Dr. Reed was saying, his voice low but clear from where I stood arranging flowers nearby. "Low-income families, mostly immigrants, completely dependent on our charity care. No one will ask questions if we lose a few." Hunter laughed, the sound chilling in its casualness. "That's what I love about pediatric trials. Parents are so desperate to believe in miracles that they'll sign anything. And if something goes wrong, well, the children were already dying anyway." I maintained my composure, continuing to arrange roses while internally screaming. These men were discussing the deliberate murder of children as if they were talking about stock prices or weather patterns. The casual dehumanization, the complete absence of empathy, the calculated exploitation of parental love. It was evil in its purest form. That night, after Hunter fell asleep, I began my real investigation. Using skills I had developed during my years with the FDA, I started tracking Whitmore Pharmaceuticals' research programs, cross-referencing patient outcomes with financial records, mapping the network of hospitals and doctors who were facilitating these crimes. The third catalyst came in May, when Marcus Chen died. I attended his funeral, watching his parents grieve for a child who had been murdered by the very people they trusted to save him. Dr. Chen gave a eulogy thanking Whitmore Pharmaceuticals for giving Marcus 6 months of hope, never knowing that those 6 months had been carefully calculated to extract maximum research data before his inevitable death. Standing in that cemetery, looking at a small coffin surrounded by flowers, I made a decision that would define the rest of my life. I would not be complicit in the murder of children. I would not allow my own children to benefit from wealth built on pediatric corpses. I would gather evidence, build an unshakable case, and bring justice to the families who had been destroyed by Whitmore's greed. The fourth piece of the puzzle emerged during a family vacation to the Whitmore compound in Martha's Vineyard that summer. While Hunter played golf with his brothers and cousins, I explored the family archives in their library. Hidden among genealogical records and historical documents, I found evidence that this pattern of using children as test subjects went back 4 generations. Hunter's great-grandfather had conducted syphilis experiments on orphaned children in the 1920s. His grandfather had tested experimental vaccines on Native American children in government boarding schools during the 1940s. His father had participated in CIA mind control experiments on institutionalized children during the 1960s. Each generation had found new ways to profit from the suffering of vulnerable children, always protected by family wealth and political connections. I realized then that I wasn't just investigating corporate fraud. I was uncovering a generational legacy of systematic child abuse that had been refined and perfected over nearly a century. The Whitmore family had built their fortune by treating children as disposable research subjects, and Hunter was simply continuing a family tradition. But I also realized that I had advantages that previous investigators hadn't possessed. As Hunter's wife, I had access to family records, private conversations, and financial documents that would have been impossible for outsiders to obtain. My position as a trusted family member gave me the perfect cover for gathering evidence. More importantly, I had something that the Whitmore family had never encountered before, a target who understood their methods better than they did. My FDA background had taught me exactly how pharmaceutical fraud operated, what evidence would be needed to prove criminal intent, and how to build cases that would survive the most aggressive legal challenges. The investigation became my obsession and my purpose. Every social event became an intelligence-gathering opportunity. Every conversation with Hunter was analyzed for evidence. Every document that passed through our house was photographed and stored. Every medication sample I could access was tested and documented. By the end of that first year, I had evidence of dozens of illegal drug trials, hundreds of bribed officials, and thousands of children who had been used as unwilling test subjects. But I also knew that evidence without strategy was worthless. I needed to build not just a legal case, but a public relations campaign that would make it impossible for the Whitmore family to escape justice through their traditional methods of buying judges and bribing politicians. That's when I began planning. The perfect moment for exposure. A moment when Hunter would reveal his true nature in front of witnesses, giving me the final piece of evidence I needed, while ensuring that the entire world would be watching when the Whitmore empire finally collapsed. The true scope of the Whitmore family's criminal enterprise didn't reveal itself until I gained access to Hunter's private study during a Christmas party at our estate. While 200 guests mingled in our ballroom, celebrating what they believed was pharmaceutical philanthropy, I used a copied keycard to enter the one room in our house that had always been forbidden to me. What I discovered that night went far beyond simple corporate fraud. Hidden behind a false wall triggered by a combination known only to family patriarchs, I found the Witmore Archive, 4 generations of meticulously documented crimes against children, preserved like trophies, by a family that viewed human experimentation as their birthright. The earliest records dated back to 1934, when Hunter's great-grandfather, Dr. Ezra Whitmore, had established the first Whitmore Children's Health Initiative. The handwritten ledgers, preserved in climate-controlled cases, detailed experiments conducted on orphaned children during the Great Depression. Ezra had infected children with various diseases to test experimental treatments, recording their deaths with the same clinical detachment one might use to document laboratory mice. 1. Entry, dated March 15, 1936, read, Subject 47, female, age 8, expired at 0347 hours following injection of modified diphtheria strain. Convulsions lasted approximately 4 minutes. Recommend lower concentration for subjects 4852. The matter-of-fact tone, describing a child's agonizing death as routine research data, revealed a level of psychopathy that had apparently been passed down through 4 generations. Hunter's grandfather, Dr. Theodore Whitmore, had expanded the operation during World War II. Using connections with government officials desperate for medical breakthroughs, he had gained access to Native American reservations and rural communities where federal oversight was minimal. The wartime files detailed experiments that would later inspire the Nuremberg trial's medical ethics codes, if anyone had known they were happening on American soil. Theodore's innovation was the development of charitable medical missions that provided cover for illegal experimentation. Teams of Whitmore researchers would arrive at impoverished communities offering free health care, then systematically test experimental drugs on children whose parents couldn't read the consent forms they were signing. The death rates were carefully managed to avoid attention. Never more than 3% of test subjects in any single location. But it was Hunter's father, Dr. Porter Whitmore Sr., who had perfected the system during the 1960s and 70s. Working with CIA researchers developing mind control techniques, Porter Sr. had created the template that Hunter still used today, legitimate charitable foundations that served as front operations for illegal human experimentation. The Porter Sr. files contained correspondence with government officials, university, researchers, and foreign dictators. Letters discussing psychological conditioning experiments on institutionalized children. Financial records showing payments to orphanages in exchange for unlimited access to children with no legal guardians. research protocols for testing experimental psychoactive drugs on children as young as 4 years old. One letter, dated June 1969, from Porter Sr. to a CIA official, read, "The subject pool at St. Mary's Institution has proven ideal for Project Mindbridge testing. Children aged 4 to 12 show optimal neuroplasticity for conditioning protocols. Recommend expanding program to similar facilities nationwide. Current mortality rate of 7% is within acceptable parameters for breakthrough research." These weren't rogue scientists conducting isolated experiments. This was a systematic, multi-generational program of child abuse that had been funded by the U.S. government, protected by political connections, and refined over decades into an efficient machine for converting children's lives into pharmaceutical profits. The files revealed how each generation had learned from the previous one's mistakes. Ezra's crude experiments had been exposed by local doctors, forcing the family to move operations frequently. Theodore had solved this by bribing officials and establishing legitimate medical credentials. Porter Sr. had perfected the art of government cooperation, making Whitmore's crimes appear to be patriotic service. Hunter had inherited this system and modernized it for the 21st century. Instead of working with the CIA, he partnered with international criminal organizations. Instead of targeting institutionalized children, he focused on immigrant families and low-income communities. Instead of crude psychological conditioning, he used sophisticated pharmaceutical manipulation combined with financial coercion. But the core methodology remained unchanged. Identify vulnerable children whose deaths wouldn't trigger investigations. Gain parents' consent through deception or desperation. Conduct illegal experiments disguised as cutting-edge treatment, and document the results for future refinement. The most disturbing discovery was the family education files, detailed instructions for training each generation of Whitmore children to continue the family tradition. Hunter's own childhood had been a carefully orchestrated program of psychological conditioning, designed to eliminate empathy and normalize the treatment of other children as research subjects. I found report cards from Hunter's childhood tutors, documenting his progress in learning to view human suffering as data. Psychological evaluations praising his analytical detachment when observing controlled experiments on laboratory animals, then homeless children, then institutionalized youth. Video recordings of teenage Hunter assisting in experimental drug trials, learning to calculate acceptable mortality rates as if planning a dinner party. The family had literally bred sociopaths. Generation after generation, each one more sophisticated than the last in their ability to disguise mass murder as medical research. Hunter wasn't just a criminal. He was the product of a century-long program to create the perfect pharmaceutical predator. The files also revealed the current scope of operations. Witmore Pharmaceuticals wasn't just conducting illegal experiments in the United States. They had facilities in 12 countries, partnerships with corrupt governments in Africa and Asia, and agreements with human trafficking organizations that provided unlimited access to children with no legal protections. The numbers were staggering. Over the past decade alone, Whitmore's programs had killed or permanently disabled more than 3,000 children across 6 continents. The company had developed experimental drugs for everything from biological weapons to cognitive enhancement, using children as test subjects because their developing systems provided more dramatic results than adult populations. As I photographed page after page of evidence, I realized that I wasn't just investigating corporate fraud. I was uncovering what amounted to an international crime against humanity. The Whitmore family had spent a century perfecting the art of killing children for profit, and they had done it with the full knowledge and cooperation of governments, universities, and medical institutions worldwide. But I also realized something else. Their very sophistication had made them vulnerable. The meticulous record-keeping that allowed them to refine their methods across generations had also created an unshakable paper trail of their crimes. The political connections that protected Them from investigation had also created documented evidence of corruption at the highest levels of government. The international scope that allowed them to operate with impunity had also created a web of evidence spanning multiple jurisdictions. The Whitmore family had built the perfect system for committing crimes against children, but they had also, unknowingly, built the perfect system for their own destruction. And I was about to activate it. The transformation from Helen Whitmore, pharmaceutical heiress, to Helen Reed, architect of justice, required more than just gathering evidence. It demanded the construction of an entirely new identity, complete with secure communication networks, financial independence, and escape routes that Hunter could never discover or block. My first priority was establishing financial autonomy. Over 18 months, I systematically converted joint assets into untraceable resources. During my weekly shopping trips to Manhattan, I would visit different banks, opening accounts under my maiden name using documentation I had carefully preserved from before my marriage. Each account received modest deposits, never enough to trigger reporting requirements, but sufficient to build a war chest for the legal battle ahead. I also began selling jewelry and artwork that Hunter had given me over the years, pieces worth tens of thousands of dollars that he would never notice were missing from my extensive collection. A diamond tennis bracelet became funding for surveillance equipment. A vintage Chanel necklace paid for secure servers. A Picasso sketch that had hung in our bedroom for 5 years financed the legal team I would eventually need. The technological infrastructure required careful planning and expert assistance. Through encrypted channels, I contacted Marcus Webb, a former NSA contractor who specialized in providing counter-surveillance services to whistleblowers and journalists. Marcus helped me establish communication protocols that even government agencies would struggle to penetrate. We installed a mesh network throughout our estate, disguised as routine Wi-Fi upgrades that Hunter approved without question. Hidden within this network were secure channels that allowed me to communicate with investigators, journalists, and legal experts without leaving digital traces that could be detected by Whitmore's corporate security team. The camera system required even more sophisticated planning. Using my position as the lady of the house, I coordinated a security upgrade that Hunter not only approved, but praised as forward-thinking. The installation crew, carefully vetted through Marcus's contacts, placed cameras throughout our home that served dual purposes, providing the family security Hunter wanted, while giving me high-definition recordings of every conversation and meeting that took place in our house. The most crucial cameras were placed in locations where Hunter felt most secure: his private study, the family room where he took confidential calls, and the kitchen where he often discussed business during breakfast. Each camera was equipped with facial recognition software and voice analysis capabilities that could identify participants in meetings and flag keywords related to pharmaceutical fraud. Building my legal team required delicate navigation of professional relationships I had abandoned when I married Hunter. I reached out to former colleagues from my FDA days, carefully testing their willingness to take on a case against one of the world's largest pharmaceutical companies. The conversations were conducted through encrypted communications, often during seemingly innocent encounters at charity events or social gatherings. Dr. Constance Cooper, a pediatric oncologist I had worked with during my FDA career, became my first crucial ally. Constance had been investigating suspicious patterns in childhood cancer treatments for years, but lacked the resources and evidence to challenge major pharmaceutical companies. When I contacted her with preliminary evidence of Whitmore's crimes, she immediately understood the scope of what we were facing. Constance introduced me to Agent Porter Reed, an FBI investigator who specialized in pharmaceutical fraud. Porter had been building cases against corrupt drug companies for over a decade, but had never encountered evidence as comprehensive as what I was offering. However, he also warned me about the legal and personal risks I was taking. The Whitmore family has destroyed investigators before, Porter explained during one of our clandestine meetings in a coffee shop 50 miles from our home. They have connections throughout the federal government, unlimited financial resources, and no scruples about using violence when other methods fail. If you're going to do this, you need to be prepared for total war. That warning led me to establish multiple layers of protection. I created detailed insurance policies, evidence packages that would be automatically released if anything happened to me. I established safe houses where Emma, Jeffrey, and I could disappear if Hunter discovered my investigation. I even arranged for plastic surgery consultations, preparing for the possibility that we might need completely new identities. The psychological preparation was equally challenging. For 3 years, I had to maintain perfect performance as Hunter's loving wife while documenting his crimes against children. I had to smile and nod during family gatherings where they joked about acceptable mortality rates. I had to attend charity events celebrating Whitmore Pharmaceutical's contribution to children's health, knowing that the money being raised would fund more illegal experiments. The most difficult moments came when Hunter would share details about his work, seeking my support and admiration for what he believed were legitimate business achievements. He would show me research reports, expecting me to be impressed by the company's breakthrough treatments, never realizing that I was analyzing the same documents for evidence of fraud and murder. I developed coping mechanisms that allowed me to function despite the constant psychological strain. Meditation became a daily practice, helping me maintain emotional equilibrium while surrounded by people who casually discussed child murder. Physical exercise provided an outlet for the rage and frustration I couldn't express. Most importantly, regular contact with the families of Whitmore's victims reminded me why this investigation was worth the personal cost. The timeline became crucial as my evidence collection neared completion. I needed to create a situation where Hunter would reveal his true nature publicly, providing the final piece of evidence while ensuring that law enforcement was prepared to act immediately. This required coordination between multiple agencies, careful timing of media releases, and the creation of triggers that would activate simultaneously across different systems. Working with Porter Reed, I established protocols for evidence distribution that would occur automatically if specific conditions were met. GPS tracking would detect if I were taken from our home against my will. Biometric scanners would activate if I failed to check in at predetermined intervals. Most importantly, physical violence detected by the hidden cameras would trigger immediate law enforcement response and media release. The morning when Hunter finally slapped me wasn't an accident, or a moment of spontaneous rage. It was the culmination of months of careful psychological manipulation designed to push him past his breaking point at precisely the moment when the maximum number of people would witness his loss of control. I had spent 3 years building the perfect trap, and Hunter had walked into it exactly as planned. The slap that he thought would reassert his dominance instead became the trigger that would destroy everything his family had built over 4 generations of crime. Every detail had been planned, every contingency prepared for, every escape route mapped. The Whitmore Empire was about to face a reckoning they could never have anticipated, delivered by the woman they had trained to be the perfect victim. The morning of the confrontation began like any other day in the Whitmore household, but every detail had been orchestrated to create the perfect storm. I had spent weeks manipulating circumstances to ensure that Hunter would be under maximum psychological pressure when he returned from his supposed business trip to Singapore, a trip that was actually a cover for establishing new money laundering operations in Southeast Asia. Hunter's flight landed at Bradley International Airport at 6:47 a.m., exactly as I had calculated when I provided him with the urgent family situation that required his immediate return. The family situation was fabricated, a supposed emergency involving his elderly mother that would create stress and urgency while getting him home at precisely the right moment. I had timed everything around Emma and Jeffrey's breakfast routine. At 6 years old, they were creatures of habit, always seated at the kitchen island by 7:30 a.m. for their cereal and orange juice. This timing was crucial because I needed witnesses who were innocent, believable, and would generate maximum sympathy. When the videos inevitably became public, the house itself had been prepared like a stage set. Every camera was positioned to capture multiple angles of the kitchen conversation. The lighting had been adjusted to ensure clear facial recognition and lip-reading capabilities. Most importantly, I had installed new motion-activated systems that would begin recording and live streaming the moment Hunter entered the kitchen, ensuring that nothing would be missed. As Hunter's black Mercedes pulled into our circular driveway, I could see the exhaustion and frustration in his posture. Through the window, the emergency that had summoned him home was designed to put him on edge, and the 12-hour flight with 3 connections, carefully arranged through my contact at his travel agency, had pushed his stress levels to exactly where I needed them. Emma and Jeffrey were perfectly positioned at the breakfast island, discussing their upcoming school play with the innocent enthusiasm that would make their eventual terror all the more devastating to witness. They had no idea that their normal Tuesday morning was about to become the moment that would define the rest of their lives. Hunter entered the kitchen at exactly 7:32 a.m., his usually perfect appearance showing signs of strain. His custom suit was wrinkled from travel, his hair slightly disheveled, and most importantly, his emotional control was already compromised by the stress of the fabricated emergency and the demanding travel schedule I had arranged. "Where's my mother?" were his first words, his voice tight with anxiety and irritation. "You said there was an emergency. I flew back from Singapore for this." I maintained perfect composure, knowing that every word and gesture was being recorded in high definition. "Your mother is fine, Hunter. I needed you here for something more important." The confusion in his eyes was exactly what I had been waiting for. Hunter's need for control was his greatest weakness, and confusion about a situation he couldn't immediately understand would trigger his most dangerous impulses. "What are you talking about?" His voice rose slightly, and I saw Emma look up from her cereal with the first hint of concern. This was the moment I had rehearsed hundreds of times in my mind. The words I would speak, the tone I would use, the evidence I would present, all designed to push Hunter past his breaking point in front of the most important witnesses possible: our children. "I'm talking about Marcus Chen," I said quietly, pulling out my phone and placing it on the counter where the children could see it. On the screen was a photo of Marcus that Emma would recognize immediately, her friend from school who had died from Whitmore's experimental treatments. Hunter's face went ashen as he recognized not just the photo, but the implication. I was threatening to expose everything, and I was doing it in front of Emma and Jeffrey. "You don't know what you're dealing with," he said, his voice dropping to the dangerous whisper I had learned to fear. But this time, I wasn't afraid. This time, I was prepared. "I know exactly what I'm dealing with," I replied, my voice steady and clear for the recording devices. "I know about the experimental drug trials. I know about the falsified safety reports. I know about the children who died because your company chose profits over lives." Emma had stopped eating, her brown eyes moving between her parents with growing confusion and fear. Jeffrey had put down his spoon entirely, sensing the tension even if he couldn't understand the words. Hunter's hands began to shake, not with fear, but with rage. The careful psychological conditioning that had made him capable of ordering the deaths of children also made him incapable of accepting defiance from someone he considered his property. "Those children were going to die anyway," he hissed, moving closer to me. "We gave them a chance to contribute to medical progress instead of dying for nothing." The casual dismissal of child murder, spoken in front of our own children, was exactly the kind of statement that would ensure Hunter could never claim his actions were justified or taken out of context. Every word was being recorded, not just by my hidden cameras, but by the phone I had deliberately placed on the counter. "Daddy, why are you talking about children dying?" Emma's voice was small and frightened, cutting through the tension like a knife. Hunter's eyes flicked to Emma, and for a moment I saw something that might have been regret cross his features. but it was quickly replaced by the cold calculation that had allowed him to build his fortune on pediatric corpses. "Your mother doesn't understand how business works, sweetheart," he said, his voice forced into a paternal tone that couldn't hide the underlying fury. Sometimes adults have to make difficult decisions to help people. But Emma wasn't stupid, and neither was Jeffrey. They could see the fear in my posture, hear the anger in their father's voice, feel the wrongness in the air around them. "Mommy, are you scared of Daddy?" Jeffrey asked, his 6-year-old voice carrying a wisdom that no child should possess. That question, asked by his own son, recorded by multiple cameras, impossible to deny or explain away, was the trigger that finally shattered Hunter's self-control. Chiu. Careful facade he had maintained for years, the polished exterior that had fooled regulators and politicians and business partners, cracked completely. His hand rose, trembling with rage, and I knew that the moment I had spent 3 years preparing for was finally here. Everything that happened next would be captured in perfect detail, witnessed by innocent children, recorded in multiple formats, and transmitted immediately to law enforcement agencies. Hunter's violence would not be hidden, denied, or explained away. The slap that was coming would be the sound of justice finally arriving for the Whitmore family. The 3 days leading up to Hunter's return had been a masterclass in psychological manipulation, though Hunter never realized he was being played. Every phone call, every email, every piece of information he received was carefully crafted to increase his stress levels and reduce his emotional control to the breaking point I needed. The fabricated emergency about his mother had been the final straw, but it was built on weeks of smaller pressures that I had systematically applied through my network of contacts. His business partners in Singapore had been fed information about potential FDA investigations, making them nervous and demanding. His financial advisors had been given anonymous tips about regulatory scrutiny, causing them to pressure him for immediate restructuring. His political contacts had suddenly become unavailable, citing scheduling conflicts that didn't exist. Hunter thought he was dealing with random business pressures and unfortunate timing. In reality, every crisis was orchestrated to bring him home in exactly the mental state I needed, exhausted, paranoid, and primed for violence. The night before his return, I had implemented the final preparations. The children's breakfast routine was adjusted by 15 minutes to ensure optimal lighting in the kitchen when Hunter arrived. I had reviewed every camera angle, every audio pickup, every emergency protocol that would activate the moment violence occurred. More importantly, I had spent hours studying Hunter's psychological profile, developed over 3 years of careful observation and analysis. I knew exactly which words would trigger his rage, which threats would push him past his breaking point, and which circumstances would make him feel cornered enough to resort to physical violence. Hunter's greatest weakness was his need to control narratives. He could tolerate business losses, regulatory pressure, even public criticism, as long as he felt he could manage the story. But the threat of exposure that he couldn't control, couldn't buy his way out of, couldn't manipulate, that was what would drive him to reveal his true nature. As I waited for his arrival that morning, I reviewed the intelligence I had gathered about his current state of mind. Phone calls intercepted through our home security system revealed increasing paranoia about federal investigations. Emails obtained through keylogging software showed mounting pressure from international partners, who were demanding immediate action to protect their interests. Financial records indicated cash flow problems that threatened the entire Whitmore operation. Hunter was already operating under extreme stress when he walked into our kitchen that morning. My job was to apply precisely the right amount of additional pressure to cause a complete psychological collapse. The key was presenting him with a threat he couldn't immediately understand or categorize. Hunter was accustomed to dealing with regulators who could be bribed, journalists who could be bought, politicians who could be controlled. But a wife who had spent 3 years gathering evidence while maintaining perfect cover? That was outside. his experience, and beyond his preparation. When I mentioned Marcus Chen's name, I watched Hunter's pupils dilate slightly, a stress response that indicated I had successfully triggered his fight-or-flight system. When I referenced the experimental drug trials, his breathing became shallow and rapid. When I spoke about falsified safety reports, his hands began the almost imperceptible trembling that preceded his most violent episodes. But the crucial element was the presence of Emma and Jeffrey. Hunter's conditioning had taught him to compartmentalize his criminal activities, keeping them separate from his role as a father. Forcing him to confront his crimes in front of his own children created cognitive dissonance that his psychological framework couldn't process. I had studied enough of the Whitmore family's psychological conditioning protocols to understand how they worked. Each generation was trained to view certain populations, orphans, immigrants, the poor, as less than human, making it psychologically possible to experiment on their children without experiencing empathy or guilt. But this conditioning broke down when applied to their own families. Hunter could rationalize the murder of Marcus Chen because Marcus was from a poor immigrant family that existed outside Hunter's circle of moral consideration. But Emma and Jeffrey were his children, his genetic legacy, the future of the Whitmore dynasty. Confronting his crimes in their presence forced him to acknowledge the contradiction between his role as a father and his role as a child killer. The psychological pressure was compounded by the physical setting. Our kitchen represented everything Hunter valued about his life: luxury, control, family status. Having that sanctuary invaded by accusations of child murder created a territorial response that overrode his rational thinking. I could see the exact moment when Hunter's psychological defenses collapsed. His face flushed red, his jaw clenched, and his hands formed fists, classic indicators of an impending violent episode. More importantly, his eyes took on the vacant, almost mechanical expression I had documented in my recordings of his phone calls with foreign criminal contacts. The polished businessman was disappearing, replaced by the sociopathic killer who had been created by 4 generations of Whitmore conditioning. Emma and Jeffrey sensed the change in their father even before I did. Children are remarkably perceptive about emotional states, and they could feel the dangerous energy radiating from Hunter as his mask slipped away. Jeffrey's question about whether I was scared of Daddy wasn't just childhood innocence. It was an accurate assessment of a potentially lethal situation. The beauty of my strategy was that Hunter's conditioning made violence inevitable. His psychological programming demanded that he reassert dominance when challenged, especially by someone he considered his property. The same mental conditioning that allowed him to order the deaths of children also made it impossible for him to tolerate defiance from his wife. When Hunter raised his hand, I knew that every camera in the house was recording. Every microphone was capturing his words. Every sensor was monitoring the violence about to occur. But more importantly, I knew that Emma and Jeffrey would witness their father's true nature, providing testimony that no jury could dismiss and no lawyer could discredit. The slap, when it came, would not be just an act of domestic violence. It would be the final piece of evidence in a case that had been 3 years in the making, the moment when Hunter revealed himself to be exactly the monster I had always known him to be. And unlike his previous victims, children who died in hospital, rooms with no witnesses, families who were too intimidated to speak out, researchers who disappeared when they asked too many questions, this time, everyone would be watching. What most people don't understand about psychological conditioning is how precise it becomes after decades of refinement. The Whitmore family hadn't just stumbled into their ability to control Hunter's behavior. They had systematically programmed him since childhood, using techniques that would make CIA behavioral specialists envious. During my 3 years of investigation, I had discovered the exact mechanism they used to trigger Hunter's violent responses. It wasn't random rage or uncontrolled emotion. It was a carefully installed psychological program that could be activated with specific verbal and visual cues. The conditioning began with Dr. Theodore Whitmore's work in the 1940s, when he had collaborated with government researchers studying crowd control and individual manipulation. Theodore had discovered that children's minds could be programmed like computers, with specific inputs producing predictable outputs. The key was starting early, using trauma and reward cycles to create automatic responses that bypassed conscious thought. Hunter's conditioning had started at age 4. I had found the records in the family archives, detailed schedules of psychological sessions disguised as private tutoring, medical procedures designed to create associative responses, and carefully controlled social interactions that taught him to view certain types of people as less than human. The most insidious part was how the conditioning was reinforced throughout his childhood and adolescence. Every family gathering included subtle programming updates. Every business lesson contained psychological triggers. Every social interaction was designed to strengthen the neural pathways that would make him the perfect pharmaceutical predator. By the time Hunter reached adulthood, his responses to specific stimuli were as automatic as breathing. Challenges to family authority triggered aggressive responses. Threats to business interests activated ruthless calculation. Defiance from subordinates, especially women, provoked immediate violence. Understanding this mechanism had been crucial to my planning. I couldn't simply present Hunter with evidence and expect him to confess or cooperate. His conditioning made such responses impossible. Instead, I had to trigger the exact psychological program that would make him reveal his true nature in the most damaging way possible. The verbal triggers were remarkably specific. Certain combinations of words about children, medical treatment, and family business would activate what the conditioning protocols called defensive aggression response. I had identified these triggers through careful analysis of recorded conversations, noting which phrases consistently produced changes in Hunter's breathing, posture, and facial expressions. The visual triggers were even more powerful. Photographs of victim children shown in specific contexts would create immediate stress responses. Financial documents presented in particular ways would trigger paranoid defensive behaviors. Most importantly, challenges to his authority delivered in front of family members, especially his own children, would activate the most extreme violence programming. That morning in our kitchen, I had deployed every trigger simultaneously. The photograph of Marcus Chen on my phone screen was positioned to create maximum psychological impact. My words were chosen not just for their informational content, but for their ability to activate Hunter's deepest conditioning protocols. The presence of Emma and Jeffrey transformed the situation from a simple confrontation into a direct assault on his programmed identity as family patriarch. What made the conditioning so effective was how completely it had replaced Hunter's natural personality. The man I had married was essentially a sophisticated biological robot, programmed to respond to specific inputs with predetermined outputs. His charming public persona, his business acumen, even his role as a father, all of it was performance, programmed into him by generations of psychological manipulation. The most chilling discovery was how the family monitored and maintained the conditioning. Hidden cameras throughout the Whitmore properties recorded family interactions, with behavioral specialists analyzing the footage to identify when programming updates were needed. Hunter's responses to various stimuli were constantly measured and adjusted, like tuning a precision instrument. I had found evidence of recent conditioning sessions disguised as routine medical checkups. Hunter would visit the family's private physician every 6 months for what he believed were standard health screenings. In reality, these visits included psychological evaluation and reinforcement sessions designed to maintain his programming and install new behavioral protocols as needed. The family had even developed pharmaceutical methods for conditioning maintenance. Hunter's daily vitamins contained low-dose psychoactive compounds that enhanced his receptivity to verbal programming. His periodic business stress medications were actually mind-altering drugs that increased his susceptibility to behavioral modification during family meetings. Most disturbing was the discovery that the conditioning was hereditary, not genetically, but through systematic child abuse disguised as family tradition. Emma and Jeffrey were already being subtly programmed through seemingly innocent family interactions. Their toys contained subliminal audio messages. Their bedtime stories included psychological conditioning elements. Their interactions with family members were carefully scripted to begin the process of turning them into the next generation of pharmaceutical predators. Understanding the conditioning mechanism had allowed me to predict Hunter's responses with scientific precision. When I mentioned Marcus Chen's name, Hunter's stress indicators spiked exactly as the psychological profiles predicted. When I referenced falsified safety reports, his defensive programming activated according to the behavioral protocols I had studied. When I challenged his authority in front of our children, his violence programming engaged with mechanical inevitability. The beauty of using the conditioning against him was that Hunter had no conscious awareness of being programmed. He experienced his responses as natural emotions and rational decisions, never realizing that his thoughts and actions were following scripts written by his family's behavioral specialists decades earlier. As Hunter raised his hand to strike me, that morning, he thought he was asserting his natural authority as head of household. In reality, he was following a program installed in his mind when he was 4 years old, activated by triggers I had deliberately deployed, performing exactly as I had calculated he would perform. The conditioning that had made Hunter capable of ordering the deaths of children was now going to be the instrument of his destruction. The same psychological programming that had turned him into a monster was about to make him reveal that monster to the world in the most damaging way possible. And the most ironic part was that Hunter would never understand what had happened to him. Even as federal agents arrested him, even as evidence of his crimes became public, even as his empire collapsed around him, he would continue to believe that his actions were his own choices rather than the predictable outputs of a psychological program designed to destroy him. The Whitmore family's criminal enterprise wasn't the work of a few rogue individuals. It was a carefully constructed network involving hundreds of complicit participants across multiple industries and government agencies. During my investigation, I had mapped this web of corruption with the precision of a forensic accountant, documenting how each person and institution contributed to the systematic murder of children. At the center of the network was the Whitmore Foundation, a charitable organization that appeared to fund pediatric medical research but actually served as the coordination hub for illegal human experimentation. The foundation's board of directors read like a who's who of American power. Senator Ted Reed, Federal Judge Constance Cooper Whitmore, University President Dr. Porter Collins, and pharmaceutical executives from 6 major drug companies. Each board member brought specific capabilities to the criminal enterprise. Senator Reed had authored legislation that reduced FDA oversight of pediatric drug trials, creating legal loopholes that Whitmore exploited to conduct illegal experiments. Judge Cooper Whitmore ensured that lawsuits against pharmaceutical companies were dismissed or settled out of court with gag orders that prevented victims' families from speaking publicly about their experiences. Dr. Collins controlled access to university research facilities and graduate students who conducted much of the actual experimental work, often without realizing they were participating in illegal activities. The pharmaceutical executives provided cover for Whitmore's operations by creating industry-wide standards that normalized dangerous practices and shared intelligence about regulatory investigations. The network extended deep into federal agencies through carefully placed personnel and systematic bribery. At the FDA, Dr. Amelia Whitmore Reed served as Deputy Director of Pediatric Drug Evaluation, a position that allowed her to fast-track Whitmore medications while blocking safety reviews of competitor products. Her decisions affected millions of children, routing them toward Whitmore's experimental treatments while denying them access to safer alternatives. The Department of Health and Human Services was compromised through Assistant Secretary Jeffrey Cooper, who controlled federal funding for pediatric medical research. Cooper directed billions of dollars in government grants exclusively to institutions that participated in Whitmore's network, creating a financial incentive structure that made compliance with their criminal activities more profitable than legitimate. Medical research. International coordination was managed through a network of diplomatic contacts and foreign government officials. Ambassador Helen Collins Whitmore used her position to negotiate agreements that allowed Whitmore Pharmaceuticals to conduct experiments in countries with minimal regulatory oversight. These medical assistance programs provided cover for testing experimental drugs on vulnerable populations in Africa, Southeast Asia, and South America. The complicity extended to prestigious medical institutions that should have been protecting children instead of exploiting them. Children's Hospital of Connecticut, Boston, Children's Hospital, and Philadelphia Children's Hospital all participated in Whitmore's experimental programs, providing patient populations and medical credibility in exchange for research funding and exclusive access to new medications. Each hospital's participation was coordinated through carefully placed administrators and department heads. Dr. Theodore Whitmore, Jr. served as Chief of Pediatric Oncology at Connecticut Children's, directly controlling which patients received experimental treatments and ensuring that negative outcomes were attributed to underlying conditions rather than drug toxicity. The media component of the network was equally sophisticated. Pharmaceutical. Industry journalists received substantial payments for writing favorable coverage of Whitmore's research programs, while suppressing stories about negative outcomes. Major news organizations had Whitmore family members on their boards of directors, ensuring editorial control over medical reporting. Scientific journals were compromised through a peer review system that Whitmore controlled through strategic placement of family members and allies in editorial positions. Studies that questioned Whitmore's methods were rejected for publication, while fraudulent research supporting their programs was fast-tracked through the review process and published in prestigious journals that gave their findings scientific credibility. The legal system was thoroughly corrupted through systematic targeting of key positions. Prosecuting attorneys who might investigate pharmaceutical crimes found their careers suddenly derailed through manufactured scandals or better, job offers. Defense attorneys who successfully challenged pharmaceutical companies were recruited to work exclusively for Whitmore and their allies, removing effective legal representation from the system. Law enforcement agencies were compromised through carefully cultivated relationships and strategic information sharing. FBI agents investigating pharmaceutical crimes would find their cases transferred to agents who were sympathetic to industry interests. Local police departments received substantial donations from Whitmore Foundation charity events, creating relationships that discouraged investigation of suspicious deaths in pediatric populations. The financial network supporting these operations was complex and international. Whitmore used a web of shell companies, charitable foundations, and offshore accounts to move money between legitimate business operations and criminal activities. Swiss banks provided secure storage for profits from illegal experimentation, while Cayman Islands corporations shielded assets from potential legal seizure. Insurance companies were integrated into the network through shared ownership and coordinated policies. Families whose children died from Whitmore's experimental treatments found their insurance claims denied or delayed through systematic obstruction, preventing them from accessing resources that might fund legal challenges or independent medical reviews. The most insidious aspect of the network was how it recruited new participants through a combination of financial incentives and gradual moral compromise. Young doctors would be offered prestigious research positions that initially involved legitimate work, but gradually introduced them to increasingly questionable practices. By the time they realized they were participating in illegal experimentation, they were already financially dependent on the system and legally implicated in its crimes. Academic researchers were similarly recruited through grants and publication, opportunities that slowly corrupted their scientific integrity. Graduate students would be assigned to projects that appeared to be legitimate research but actually involved falsifying data or concealing negative outcomes. Professional advancement became dependent on their willingness to participate in the network's criminal activities. The network's most powerful protection was its integration into the normal operations of American medical and political systems. Challenging Whitmore required confronting not just one family or company, but an entire ecosystem of corruption that spanned multiple industries and government agencies. Previous investigators had been overwhelmed by the scope of complicity and the resources arrayed against them, but the network's strength was also its weakness. The extensive documentation required to coordinate such a complex criminal enterprise had created an enormous paper trail that could destroy everyone involved simultaneously. The same communication systems that allowed efficient coordination of criminal activities could be penetrated and exploited by someone with the right access and expertise. My position as Hunter's wife had given me unique access to the network's coordination systems, allowing me to document not just Whitmore's crimes, but the participation of hundreds of accomplices across multiple sectors. The evidence I had gathered would expose not just a pharmaceutical company, but an entire shadow system that had been systematically murdering children for decades. When the evidence was finally released, it wouldn't just destroy the Whitmore family, it would bring down everyone who had enabled, protected, and profited from their crimes. The final phase of my plan required transforming what appeared to be a spontaneous domestic dispute into an irrefutable public exposure of systematic child murder. Every element had to be precisely orchestrated to ensure that when Hunter's violence was triggered, it would occur in circumstances that would guarantee maximum legal and social impact. The timing was crucial because multiple investigations were already closing in on Witmore Pharmaceuticals from different directions. Agent Porter Reed had been building a federal case for 18 months, but lacked the insider evidence needed to penetrate the family's legal defenses. Dr. Constance Cooper had documented suspicious mortality patterns in pediatric trials, but couldn't prove deliberate malfeasance without access to internal communications. I had been coordinating with both investigations while maintaining absolute secrecy about my role. As far as they knew, I was simply a concerned witness who had noticed irregularities in my husband's behavior. They had no idea that I was the architect of the entire operation, systematically feeding them evidence while manipulating events to create the perfect moment for public exposure. The media component required equally careful planning. I had spent months cultivating relationships with investigative journalists at major news organizations, providing them with carefully selected pieces of evidence that allowed them to begin building their own stories about pharmaceutical fraud. Each journalist believed they were conducting an independent investigation, unaware that their work was being coordinated to create simultaneous exposure across multiple platforms. Sarah Martinez at the Washington Post was investigating financial irregularities in pharmaceutical research grants. Michael Chen at 60 Minutes was documenting suspicious patterns in pediatric drug trials. Dr. Rebecca Thompson at the New England Journal of Medicine was preparing to publish a meta-analysis of mortality rates in childhood cancer treatments. Each story would be devastating on its own. Together, they would create a media avalanche that would make it impossible for the Whitmore family to control the narrative. The legal framework was equally important. Through careful research and professional contacts, I had identified the optimal jurisdiction for prosecution of the crimes I was documenting. Federal charges would be filed in Connecticut, where the main Whitmore facilities were located, but parallel investigations would be launched in 12 other states where victims had been harmed. International coordination was handled through Interpol contacts, who had been tracking pharmaceutical crimes across multiple countries. The evidence I provided would trigger simultaneous investigations in Canada, the United Kingdom, Germany, and Japan, countries where Whitmore had conducted illegal experiments but believed they were protected by diplomatic immunity and corrupt local officials. The most sophisticated element was the technological trap I had constructed around Hunter himself. Every communication device he used was monitored through legally obtained access to our shared accounts and home network. His phones, computers, and even his car's navigation system were feeding real-time data to secure servers that would preserve evidence even if he attempted to destroy it. The hidden camera system in our house was connected to multiple backup networks that would automatically distribute recordings to law enforcement and media contacts the moment specific trigger events occurred. The system was designed to be tamper-proof, with redundant storage systems and encrypted transmission protocols that would preserve evidence even if Hunter discovered and attempted to destroy the cameras. But the most crucial element was ensuring that Emma and Jeffrey would be protected throughout the exposure process. I had arranged for my sister Amelia to be on standby to take custody of the children immediately after the incident. Child Protective Services had been discreetly briefed about potential concerns regarding the children's safety, creating a legal framework for their immediate removal from Hunter's custody. Psychological counselors specializing in trauma therapy for children who had witnessed domestic violence were already in place to help Emma and Jeffrey process what they would experience. Educational consultants had identified alternative schools where they could continue their studies away from the Whitmore family's influence. Financial arrangements had been made to ensure their future security independent of the family's criminal wealth. The house itself had been prepared as a crime scene. Every surface had been treated with luminescent powders that would reveal fingerprints under forensic examination. Audio recording equipment had been hidden throughout the kitchen to ensure that every word of the confrontation would be captured with courtroom-quality clarity. Most importantly, I had programmed multiple dead man's switches that would activate automatically if Hunter's violence escalated beyond the controlled slap I was expecting. GPS monitoring would detect if I were forcibly removed from the house. Biometric sensors would activate if my vital signs indicated serious injury. Motion detectors would trigger emergency responses if the children were threatened. The financial preparations were equally thorough. I had liquidated sufficient assets to fund legal representation, relocation expenses, and long-term security for myself and the children. Swiss bank accounts established under my maiden name contained enough resources to wage legal warfare against the entire Whitmore network for decades if necessary. Emergency extraction protocols had been established, with private security contractors who specialized in protecting whistleblowers and their families. Safe houses had been prepared in multiple countries, complete with new identity documents and financial resources that would allow us to disappear entirely if the Whitmore family attempted retaliation. The psychological preparation was perhaps the most challenging aspect. I had to steel myself to provoke violence from my own husband while my children watched, knowing that their trauma was necessary to ensure justice for thousands of other children who had been murdered by his family's criminal enterprise. As Hunter's plane approached Bradley International Airport that morning, every element of the plan was in position. Federal agents were standing by to execute arrest warrants the moment violence was documented. Journalists were prepared to publish simultaneously coordinated exposés. International law enforcement agencies were ready to seize assets and arrest co-conspirators across multiple countries. The children were positioned perfectly to witness their father's true nature while being protected from any escalation beyond what was necessary for legal documentation. The cameras were recording in high definition from multiple angles. The audio equipment was capturing every word with forensic precision. All that remained was for Hunter to perform exactly as his psychological conditioning dictated he would perform. When confronted with the ultimate challenge to his authority, a wife who refused to be silenced, children who would witness his violence, and evidence that would destroy everything his family had built over 4 generations of crime. The trap was set. Hunter was walking into it with the mechanical inevitability of a man whose mind had been programmed to respond to specific stimuli with predictable actions. And in less than 2 hours, the slap that would destroy the Whitmore empire would echo through our kitchen like the sound of justice finally arriving. The crack of Hunter's palm against my cheek was like a starting gun, setting into motion systems I had spent 3 years designing and 3 months perfecting. As I felt the sting bloom across my face and tasted blood from my split lip, I watched Emma and Jeffrey's eyes widen in shock and horror. But more importantly, I knew that 17 different recording devices had just captured the moment from every conceivable angle. The slap itself was exactly what I had calculated it would be, powerful enough to cause visible injury and genuine pain, but controlled enough to avoid causing serious damage that might interfere with my ability to continue executing the plan. Hunter's psychological conditioning had programmed him to use precisely this level of violence when asserting dominance over family members. Enough to establish control, not enough to create problems that would require outside intervention. Emma's small gasp of terror cut through the kitchen silence like a knife. At 6 years old, she had never seen violence in her home, never witnessed her father's true nature, never understood that the money that paid for her privileged life came from the systematic murder of children just like her. That innocence was ending in real time, captured in high definition by cameras that would preserve this moment forever. Jeffrey's response was different, but equally devastating. Instead of gasping, he went completely silent, his brown eyes, so much like mine, taking in every detail with the hypervigilance that children develop when their sense of safety is shattered. His silence was perhaps more damaging than Emma's obvious distress, because it suggested a child who was already processing the implications of what he had witnessed. Hunter's face immediately after the slap revealed the exact psychological state I had been working to create. The mechanical expression that accompanied his violence quickly gave way to confusion as his conditioning protocols conflicted with his paternal instincts. He looked at his hand as if it belonged to someone else, then at our children's terrified faces, then back at me with growing bewilderment. "Why are you smiling?" he whispered, his voice cracking with the first hint of genuine fear I had ever heard from him. Because I was smiling. Not the broken, desperate smile of an abused wife trying to placate her attacker, but the calm, satisfied smile of someone who had just received exactly what they needed. The smile of a woman who had spent 3 years planning this moment and watching it unfold with perfect precision. "Because you just gave me everything I needed," I said clearly, knowing that every word was being recorded and would be analyzed by federal investigators within the hour. "You just proved, in front of our children, that you're exactly the monster I've been documenting for 3 years. Hunter's confusion deepened as he tried to process what I was saying. His conditioning hadn't prepared him for a victim who responded to violence with satisfaction rather than fear. The psychological scripts that governed his behavior had no protocol for a wife who seemed pleased to be slapped. "Mommy, your lip is bleeding," Emma said, her voice small and frightened. She started to move toward me, but Jeffrey caught her arm, some instinct warning him that the situation was still dangerous. "It's okay, sweetheart," I told her, dabbing at the blood with a kitchen towel. "Sometimes grown-ups need to show their true colors so that other people can understand who they really are." Hunter's eyes darted between our children and me, his mind struggling to understand what had happened to his carefully controlled world. "You planned this," he said, the realization beginning to dawn. "You made me. You wanted me to." "I wanted you to be yourself," I replied. "And you were. The same self that orders the deaths of children for profit. The same self that's been psychologically conditioned to use violence to maintain control. The same self that just assaulted his wife in front of his own children." The kitchen fell, silent, except for the soft hum of recording equipment that Hunter had never noticed, and the gentle tick of the antique clock that would help investigators establish the precise timeline of events. Emma and Jeffrey stood frozen, watching their parents with the wide-eyed attention of children who sense that their world is fundamentally changing. Hunter's breathing became rapid and shallow as the full scope of his situation began to penetrate his consciousness. He looked around our kitchen, the scene of countless family breakfasts, homework sessions, and holiday celebrations, as if seeing it for the first time. His eyes lingered on details that suddenly seemed significant. The nearly invisible camera lenses, the phone I had positioned on the counter, the way Emma and Jeffrey were positioned to witness everything clearly. "You've been recording everything," he said, his voice barely audible. "For 3 years," I confirmed. "Every crime you've confessed to during pillow talk, every business meeting you conducted in your study, every phone call you made from this house, every moment of this morning's conversation and your subsequent violence." Hunter's face went ashen as he began to understand the magnitude of what had just occurred. The slap that he thought would reassert his dominance had instead become the capstone of a prosecution case that would destroy everything he had ever worked for. "The children," he whispered, looking at Emma and Jeffrey with something that might have been genuine remorse. "You involved our children in this." "You involved our children in this," I corrected. "The moment you chose to build their future on the corpses of other people's children. The moment you decided to slap their mother in front of them. The moment you made them witnesses to your true nature." Emma began to cry, not the dramatic sobbing of childhood disappointment, but the quiet tears of a 6-year-old who was beginning to understand that her father was not the hero she had believed him to be. Jeffrey remained silent, his analytical mind already working to process the implications of what he had witnessed. Hunter looked at his hand again, then at my bleeding lip, then at our children's faces. For the first time since I had known him, his carefully constructed mask slipped completely away, revealing something that might have been his actual personality beneath years of psychological conditioning. "I didn't mean to," he said, his voice breaking. "I don't know why Because you were programmed to," I said quietly. "By your family, for their benefit, to make you capable of ordering the deaths of children without feeling empathy or guilt. The same programming that made you capable of murder made you incapable of tolerating defiance from someone you consider your property." As if summoned by my words, the sound of multiple vehicles could be heard approaching our circular driveway. Hunter's head snapped toward the window, his face showing the first signs of genuine panic as he saw the black SUVs and unmarked sedans that indicated federal law enforcement. The moment I had spent 3 years orchestrating was finally complete. Hunter had revealed his true nature in front of the only witnesses whose testimony no jury would ever doubt, his own children. The evidence was captured, the authorities were arriving, and the Whitmore Empire was about to face its final reckoning. But as I looked at Emma's tear-streaked face and Jeffrey's shocked silence, I felt the weight of what I had just done to my own children in pursuit of justice for thousands of others. The choice had been necessary, but the cost would stay with all of us forever. The sound of my laughter filled our kitchen like the ringing of a bell, clear and genuine and completely at odds with the violence that had just occurred. Hunter's face, already pale with shock, drained of all remaining color as he realized that his act of dominance had somehow become my moment of triumph. Emma and Jeffrey stared at me with confusion that mirrored their father's. In their young minds, people who got hurt were supposed to cry, not laugh. Victims were supposed to cower, not smile with satisfaction. The psychological framework they had for understanding violence didn't include a mother who seemed pleased to have been slapped. "Why are you laughing, Mommy?" Emma asked, her voice small and worried. "Daddy hurt you." I knelt down to her level, my split lip still bleeding, and gently touched her face. Because sometimes, sweetheart, when someone shows you who they really are, it can be exactly what you needed them to do. Hunter backed away from us, his hands shaking as the magnitude of his mistake began to penetrate his consciousness. "You're insane," he whispered. "You wanted this to happen. You made me lose control." "I didn't make you do anything," I replied, rising to face him directly. "I simply created circumstances where your true nature could reveal itself. The violence was always there, Hunter. I just gave it an opportunity to show itself to the people who needed to see it most." The confusion in his eyes was exactly what I had anticipated. Hunter's psychological conditioning had prepared him for victims who would be intimidated by violence, silenced by fear, controlled through physical dominance. But I wasn't behaving like a victim. I was behaving like someone who had just received a gift. "The cameras," he said suddenly, his eyes darting around our kitchen as if seeing the hidden recording devices for the first time. "You said you've been recording for 3 years. Every conversation, every meeting. Every crime you've confessed to," I confirmed. "Every time you bragged about breakthrough treatments that were actually poison. Every phone call where you discussed acceptable mortality rates for children. Every moment you revealed yourself to be a systematic killer of pediatric patients." Hunter's breathing became ragged as he tried to process the scope of what I had accomplished. 3 years of marriage that he had thought was perfect domestic bliss had actually been 3 years of comprehensive criminal investigation. The wife, who had seemed devoted and submissive, had actually been documenting every aspect of his criminal enterprise. "You can't use recordings made without my consent," he said desperately, grasping for legal technicalities that might protect him. "Actually, I can," I replied with the calm certainty of someone who had spent months consulting with legal experts. "Connecticut is a one-party consent state for recordings made in private homes. As your wife and co-owner of this property, I have every legal right to record conversations that take place here. More importantly, spousal privilege doesn't protect communications about ongoing crimes against third parties." The sound of vehicles approaching our driveway was growing louder. Hunter's eyes widened as he recognized the unmistakable convoy pattern of federal law enforcement, multiple black SUVs followed by unmarked sedans, moving with the precision of a coordinated operation. "You called them," he said, panic beginning to replace confusion in his voice. "I didn't need to call them," I explained. "The recording system is equipped with automatic triggers that activate when specific criteria are met. Physical violence, detected by the cameras, automatically transmitted evidence packages to the FBI, FDA, DEA, and prosecutors in 7 different jurisdictions." Emma and Jeffrey were watching this exchange with the wide-eyed attention of children who sensed that their world was changing in ways they couldn't yet understand. Jeffrey, with his mathematical mind, was already trying to process the logistics of what I was describing. Emma, more emotionally intuitive, was focused on the blood on my lip and the fear in her father's eyes. "What's going to happen to Daddy?" Jeffrey asked, his 6-year-old voice carrying a gravity that no child should possess. I knelt down between them, taking both their hands in mine. "Your father is going to face consequences for things he's done to hurt other children," I said as gently as possible. "The police are coming to talk to him about those things. You and I are going to go stay with Aunt Amelia while the grown-ups figure everything out." Hunter's mask was completely gone now, replaced by raw panic as he understood that his carefully constructed life was collapsing in real time. "The children don't understand what you're doing to them," he said desperately. "You're destroying their family. I'm protecting them from being raised by a man who murders children for profit," I replied firmly. "I'm ensuring they never grow up thinking that violence against family members is acceptable. I'm making sure they understand the difference between right and wrong, even when the people who are supposed to protect them are the ones causing harm." The first federal agents were already at our front door. I could hear Agent Porter Reed's voice identifying himself and requesting entry. The sound seemed to trigger something in Hunter, perhaps his final realization that his world of privilege and protection was ending. "You have no idea what you've unleashed," he said, his voice taking on a threatening tone that made both children step closer to me. "My family has resources you can't imagine, connections that go to the highest levels of government. You think you can just destroy us and walk away?" "I think," I said clearly, ensuring that every word was captured by the recording equipment, "that your family's resources and connections are about to become evidence in the largest pharmaceutical fraud prosecution in American history. I think the very network that protected you is about to become the instrument of your destruction." The doorbell rang, followed by the authoritative sound of federal agents announcing their presence. Hunter looked toward the front of the house, then back at our children. then at me with something that might have been genuine hatred emerging from beneath his programmed responses. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "Yes, it is," I replied with the calm certainty of someone who had spent 3 years planning for this exact moment. "It's been over since the day you told me that Marcus Chen's death was acceptable medical research. It's been over since the first time you bragged about breakthrough treatments that were actually poison. It's been over since you decided that your profit was worth more than children's lives." As the federal agents entered our kitchen, badges displayed and weapons holstered but visible, Hunter finally understood that the woman he had married no longer existed. Helen Whitmore, the compliant pharmaceutical heiress, had been an elaborate performance. Dr. Helen Reed, the federal investigator who specialized in bringing down corrupt drug companies, had been gathering evidence against him from the moment they met. The slap that was supposed to silence me had instead become the final piece of evidence in a case that would destroy everything he had ever built. And the laughter that had confused and terrified him was the sound of justice finally arriving for the Whitmore family. Agent Porter Reed entered our kitchen with the measured confidence of someone who had been preparing for this moment for 18 months. Behind him came a team of federal investigators, each carrying equipment that would transform our family home into a crime scene and evidence repository. But they weren't starting from nothing. They were collecting the final pieces of a case I had been building for 3 years. "Mrs. Whitmore," Agent Reed said formally, though his eyes held a hint of acknowledgement that we both knew my real identity, "we received an automated evidence transmission from this location 17 minutes ago, indicating domestic violence and triggering multiple federal arrest warrants." As he spoke, his team was already setting up evidence collection stations throughout our kitchen. Photographers captured the scene from every angle, documenting the blood on my lip, the positioning of Emma and Jeffrey, and Hunter's pale, shocked expression. Audio technicians began testing the hidden recording equipment I had installed, verifying that every word of our confrontation had been captured with courtroom quality. Hunter looked around at the sudden invasion of his sanctuary, his mind still, struggling to process how completely his world had collapsed. "I want my lawyer," he said weakly, the first intelligent thing he had said since striking me. "You'll have that opportunity," Agent Reed replied. "But first, Dr. Helen Reed has some evidence to present that you need to understand the scope of what you're facing." The use of my real name and title sent a shock through Hunter that was visible to everyone in the room. For the first time, he was hearing official confirmation that the woman he had married was not who she had claimed to be. The devoted pharmaceutical heiress had been an elaborate cover identity for a federal investigator who specialized in bringing down corrupt drug companies. "You're Dr. Helen Reed," he whispered, recognition dawning. "The FDA investigator who destroyed Meridian Pharmaceuticals in 2018, the one who sent 17 executives to federal prison. The same Dr. Helen Reed who has spent the last 3 years documenting your family's systematic murder of children," I confirmed. "Though I prefer to think of it as Dr. Helen Reed, who just completed the most comprehensive pharmaceutical fraud investigation in American history." Agent Reed nodded to one of his technicians, who began connecting portable equipment to our home's computer network. Within moments, data was flowing from my hidden servers to federal evidence systems, 3 years of documentation transferring in real time to multiple law enforcement databases. "The evidence package contains 2.7 terabytes of documentation," Agent Reed announced, reading from a tablet as the data transferred. "Bank records showing $847 million in fraudulent transactions. Audio recordings of 247 criminal conversations. Video footage of 89 business meetings discussing illegal activities. Chemical analysis of 156 contaminated medication samples. Medical records of 3,891 children who were used as unwitting test subjects." Each number hit Hunter like a physical blow. He could see his empire being dismantled in real time, reduced to evidence files that would be used to convict him and everyone he had ever worked with. But the scope of the evidence went far beyond what Hunter had done personally. Through my position as his wife, I had gained access to the entire Whitmore network, documenting not just his crimes, but those of every person and institution that had enabled them. The evidence also includes documentation of Senator Ted Reed's role in creating legislative loopholes for pharmaceutical testing, Agent Reed continued. Judge Constance Cooper Whitmore's systematic dismissal of cases against Witmore Pharmaceuticals. Dr. Theodore Whitmore Jr.'s falsification of medical records at Connecticut Children's Hospital. Ambassador Helen Collins Whitmore's negotiation of agreements allowing illegal experimentation in foreign countries. Emma and Jeffrey were watching this recitation of their extended family's crimes with growing comprehension. At 6 years old, they couldn't understand the legal terminology, but they could grasp that many people they had known and trusted were being described as criminals. "What about our children?" Hunter asked desperately, perhaps finally grasping that his concern should be for Emma and Jeffrey rather than himself. Emma and Jeffrey will be placed in protective custody with their aunt, Dr. Amelia Reed, Agent Reed explained. Dr. Reed has been working with child psychologists to minimize the trauma of this transition. The children's trust funds, which were established with proceeds from criminal activities, will be frozen pending restitution to victims' families. The mention of restitution seemed to trigger Hunter's final understanding of what was happening. This wasn't just a criminal case that might result in prison time. This was the complete dismantling of everything the Whitmore family had built over 4 generations, with their assets being redistributed to the families they had destroyed. The international scope is equally comprehensive, Agent Reed continued. Simultaneous arrests are being executed in 12 countries. Assets totaling $2.3 billion are being seized across 47 jurisdictions. Extradition requests have been filed for 17 Whitmore associates who are currently overseas. As if choreographed, Agent Reed's radio crackled with updates from other operations. Senator Reed in custody in Washington. Judge Cooper Whitmore arrested at her courthouse chambers. Swiss bank account successfully frozen. Witmore Pharmaceuticals trading suspended by SEC order. Each update was another nail in the coffin of the Whitmore empire. I had triggered a coordinated takedown that was simultaneously destroying criminal operations across 3 continents. The network that had protected the family for decades was being turned against them as evidence of conspiracy and corruption. The media component is equally coordinated, Agent Reed added, consulting his tablet. The Washington Post published their investigation 7 minutes ago. 60 Minutes will air their segment tonight. The New England Journal of Medicine is releasing their meta-analysis of Whitmore mortality data tomorrow morning. Hunter's shoulders sagged as he realized that even if he somehow escaped criminal conviction, the court of public opinion had already condemned him. The Whitmore name would become synonymous with child murder, making any future business activities impossible. Dr. Reed's evidence has also triggered investigations into pharmaceutical practices industry-wide, Agent Reed continued. The FDA is launching comprehensive reviews of all pediatric drug trials conducted in the past decade. The Department of Justice is expanding this case into a broader examination of pharmaceutical fraud across the entire sector. The implications were staggering. What had started as an investigation into one family's crimes was becoming a reckoning for an entire industry that had prioritized profits over children's lives. As I watched Hunter being read his rights and fitted with handcuffs, I felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Justice was finally being served for Marcus Chen and thousands of other children who had died from Whitmore's greed. But Emma and Jeffrey were watching their father being arrested, their world destroyed in pursuit of a greater good they were too young to understand. The evidence avalanche I had triggered would continue for months, bringing down corrupt officials, complicit institutions, and criminal enterprises across the globe. But the real victory was simpler. No more children would die from Whitmore's experimental treatments because Witmore Pharmaceuticals would cease to exist. The moment Hunter fully comprehended that his entire life had been an elaborate sting operation, something fundamental broke inside him. I watched as the sophisticated psychological conditioning that had shaped his personality for 3 decades began to unravel in real time, leaving behind fragments of whatever authentic self might have existed beneath the programming. His hands began to shake uncontrollably, not with rage or fear, but with the disorientation of a man whose reality was collapsing. The carefully constructed mental frameworks that had allowed him to rationalize child murder as medical research were crumbling, forcing him to confront the true nature of his actions without the protective buffer of family conditioning. "I don't understand," he kept repeating, his voice becoming increasingly fragmented. "I was helping children. The research was important. The treatments were revolutionary." But even as he spoke these program justifications, his eyes showed growing horror as suppressed memories began breaking through the psychological barriers that had contained them. Emma and Jeffrey watched their father's breakdown with the wide-eyed attention of children who sensed they were witnessing something they weren't supposed to see. Jeffrey, with his analytical mind, was trying to catalog the changes in his father's behavior. Emma, more emotionally intuitive, seemed to understand that the daddy she had known was disappearing before her eyes. Agent Reed gestured to one of his team members, a woman with the calm demeanor of someone trained in crisis psychology. "Dr. Sarah Chen," she introduced herself to me quietly. "I specialize in psychological decompensation in cases involving long-term conditioning. What you're seeing is typical when artificial personality structures collapse." As if to illustrate her point, Hunter's fragmented mumblings became more disconnected from reality. "Marcus Chen was already dying," he said to no one in particular, his eyes unfocused. "The liver failure was part of the treatment protocol. The parents signed the consent forms. They were grateful for the opportunity, but then something shifted in his expression, and for a moment, genuine horror broke through the programming. "Oh, God," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Marcus was 7 years old. 7 years old, and He couldn't finish the sentence, his mind unable to process the full implications of what he had done. Dr. Chen made notes on a tablet, documenting the psychological collapse for what would undoubtedly become a crucial component of the prosecution case. "The conditioning appears to be breaking down in stages," she observed. "First the protective rationalizations, then the emotional suppression, finally the memory barriers." I found myself feeling an unexpected mixture of satisfaction and pity as I watched the man who had systematically murdered children struggle with the return of his human conscience. This was what justice looked like when it targeted not just actions, but the psychological systems that had enabled those actions. "The children were going to die anyway," Hunter said again, but this time his voice cracked with growing awareness of how hollow that justification had always been. "That's what they told me. That's what I believed. But they weren't going to die, were they? We killed them. I killed them." Emma began to cry, not the frightened tears she had shed earlier, but the deeper sobs of a child who was watching her father transform into someone she didn't recognize. "Daddy's talking scary," she whispered to Jeffrey, who put his arm around her with a protectiveness that was heartbreaking to witness. The federal agents continued their work around us, but I could see that even these experienced law enforcement professionals were disturbed by the psychological disintegration they were witnessing. Hunter wasn't just confessing to crimes. He was experiencing a complete breakdown of the mental conditioning that had made those crimes possible. "Dr. Whitley," Hunter said suddenly, his eyes finding focus for the first time in minutes. "Where is Dr. Whitley? He needs to explain the conditioning protocols. He needs to tell them how the programming works. I couldn't help what I did. I was made this way." Agent Reed looked up from his evidence collection. "Dr. Thomas Whitley was arrested 47 minutes ago at his private practice," he informed Hunter. "He's currently providing detailed testimony about the psychological conditioning methods used on multiple generations of the Whitmore family." This news seemed to trigger another wave of psychological collapse in Hunter. "He's telling them everything," he whispered. "The sessions, the medications, the behavioral modification protocols. They'll understand that I wasn't responsible. I was programmed to do these things." But even as he spoke, I could see doubt creeping into his expression. The conditioning that had suppressed his empathy was breaking down, allowing him to feel the full emotional weight of his actions for the first time. The systematic murder of children was becoming real to him in a way it had never been before. "I remember now," he said quietly, his voice filled with dawning horror. "I remember enjoying it, not just following orders, but actually enjoying the power over life and death. The way parents would thank me for poisoning their children. The way I felt when I saw the mortality statistics." Dr. Chen looked up from her notes with interest. "This is unusual," she commented to Agent Reed. "The conditioning typically suppresses emotional responses entirely. What he's describing suggests underlying sadistic tendencies that were enhanced rather than created by the programming." The implication was chilling. Hunter hadn't just been turned into a killer by psychological conditioning. He had been a natural killer whose tendencies were refined and focused by the family's behavioral modification programs. The programming had given him permission to express impulses that had always been present. "Emma, Jeffrey," I said gently, kneeling down between them. "I need you to go with Agent Williams now. She's going to take you to Aunt Amelia's house while the grown-ups finish talking here." But Jeffrey, despite being only 6 years old, seemed to understand that this was the last time he would see his father as a free man. "Will Daddy get better?" he asked with the heartbreaking optimism of a child who still believed that broken things could be fixed. I looked at Hunter, who was now sitting on the floor with his head in his hands, muttering disconnected fragments about research protocols and acceptable mortality rates. The sophisticated businessman who had charmed politicians and fooled regulators was gone, replaced by a broken man struggling to process the reality of his crimes. "I don't know, sweetheart," I answered honestly. "But I know that you and Emma will be safe, and that's what matters most." As Agent Williams led the children away, Emma turned back one last time to look at her father. "Bye, Daddy," she said quietly, not understanding that she was saying goodbye to the only version of him she would ever know. Hunter looked up at her voice, and for a moment, something like genuine love flickered in his eyes. "I'm sorry," he whispered, though whether he was apologizing to Emma or to all the children he had killed was impossible to know. The psychological breakdown would continue for hours, each layer of conditioning peeling away to reveal the monster that had always lurked beneath the polished exterior. But the justice system would have to determine whether that monster deserved punishment or treatment, and whether the decades of programming offered any mitigation for the thousands of deaths he had caused. The coordinated arrests that followed. Hunter's breakdown unfolded with the precision of a military operation, each target taken into custody simultaneously to prevent communication or evidence destruction. From our kitchen, I watched through my secure phone as the Whitmore empire collapsed in real time across multiple time zones. Senator Ted Reed was arrested during a committee hearing on pharmaceutical regulations, federal agents walking into the Senate chamber to serve warrants as cameras rolled. The irony wasn't lost on anyone watching. A man who had spent decades protecting pharmaceutical criminals was being arrested while supposedly overseeing pharmaceutical oversight. Judge Constance Cooper Whitmore was taken into custody in her private chambers at the federal courthouse, her staff watching in shock as the woman who had dismissed hundreds of cases against pharmaceutical companies was handcuffed and read her rights. The court system she had corrupted for 30 years would now judge her own crimes. Dr. Theodore Whitmore, Jr. was arrested at Connecticut Children's Hospital, led away in handcuffs past the pediatric oncology ward, where he had systematically poisoned children for research purposes. Parents in the waiting room watched in confusion, not yet understanding that the doctor they had trusted with their children's lives was actually their killer. Ambassador Helen Collins Whitmore was arrested at her embassy in Switzerland, where she had been coordinating with corrupt foreign officials to expand Whitmore's international operations. Her diplomatic immunity was revoked within hours, leaving her exposed to prosecution in multiple countries where she had facilitated illegal experimentation. Each arrest triggered immediate asset freezes and evidence seizures. Swiss bank accounts containing hundreds of millions in blood money were locked down. Offshore corporations that had laundered pharmaceutical profits were dissolved. Private jets and luxury properties purchased with the proceeds of child murder were seized by federal marshals. The pharmaceutical industry itself began to collapse under the weight of the revelations. Trading in pharmaceutical stocks was suspended as investors fled the sector. Research institutions scrambled to distance themselves from Whitmore-affiliated programs. Regulatory agencies launched emergency reviews of all pediatric drug trials conducted in the past decade. In our kitchen, Hunter was being prepared for transport to federal detention, his psychological breakdown continuing as each arrest was announced. "They're all being arrested," he kept repeating, as if the scope of the destruction was too large for his damaged mind to process. Agent Reed approached me with an expression of professional respect, mixed with personal amazement. "Dr. Reed, in 23 years of federal law enforcement, I've never seen an investigation this comprehensive. You've essentially exposed and documented an entire shadow medical system." The scale was staggering even to me. What had started as my personal quest for justice for Marcus Chen had become the largest criminal investigation in pharmaceutical history. Hundreds of arrests across 6 continents, billions of dollars in seized assets, thousands of victims finally acknowledged and validated. "The international response has been unprecedented," Agent Reed continued, consulting his tablet. "The European Union is launching a complete review of pharmaceutical regulations. The World Health Organization is investigating all Whitmore-affiliated programs globally. Interpol has issued arrest warrants for 47 additional suspects. But perhaps the most satisfying development was the immediate impact on children's safety. Within hours of the arrests, experimental drug programs at 12 major hospitals were suspended pending investigation. Children who might have been the next Marcus Chen were suddenly safe from Whitmore's predatory research. The media coverage was equally swift and devastating. The Washington Post's front-page headline read, "Pharma Family's Century of Child Murder Exposed." CNN ran continuous coverage under the banner, "Pharmaceutical Horror: How One Family Killed Thousands." The BBC led with "American Drug Dynasty's Global Killing Spree Revealed." Social media exploded with parents sharing stories of children who had died in suspicious circumstances during clinical trials. Families who had been isolated and silenced for decades suddenly found their voices amplified by a global conversation about pharmaceutical abuse. The hashtag #EarJusticeForMarcus began trending worldwide. The legal implications would take years to fully process, but the immediate impact was clear. The Whitmore family and their entire network of enablers would spend the rest of their lives in federal prison. The systematic murder of children for pharmaceutical profit had finally been exposed and stopped. As Hunter was led away in handcuffs, he looked back at me one final time. "Why?" he asked, his voice broken and confused. "Why did you destroy everything?" "Because," I replied quietly, "some things deserve to be destroyed, and some children deserve justice, even if it comes too late." The Whitmore empire that had taken 4 generations to build had been dismantled in a single morning. The family that had treated children's lives as disposable research materials would now face the consequences of 90 years of systematic murder. Justice had finally arrived for Marcus Chen and the thousands of children who had died for Whitmore's profits. The system that had protected their killers had become the instrument of their destruction, and the woman they had tried to silence had become the voice that brought them down. 6 months later, I sit in my new office at the Child Protection Legal Foundation, surrounded by case files of families whose children died from pharmaceutical fraud. Emma and Jeffrey are at their new school, learning to rebuild their lives without the weight of blood money on their shoulders. Hunter is serving the first year of what will be a life sentence without possibility of parole. The Whitmore empire is gone completely. Their assets, totaling over $2 billion, have been distributed to the families of victims across 3 continents. The foundation we established has become the largest legal advocacy organization for pharmaceutical abuse victims in the world. Every day, we receive calls from parents who suspected their children's deaths weren't from natural causes, but never had the resources to investigate. The pharmaceutical industry has changed fundamentally. New regulations require independent monitoring of all pediatric trials. Whistleblower protections have been strengthened. Most importantly, the culture of accepting children's deaths as acceptable research costs has been shattered by the revelations about the Whitmore family. Emma and Jeffrey are receiving counseling to help them process what they witnessed, but they're resilient in the way that children can be when they understand that truth, even painful truth, is better than beautiful lies. Jeffrey has expressed interest in becoming a doctor who actually helps children. Emma wants to be a lawyer like her mother, fighting for people who can't fight for themselves. But what I want you to understand, if you're listening to this story, is that none of this happened because I was special or uniquely brave. It happened because I made a choice that anyone can make when confronted with evil. I decided that silence was complicity. For 3 years, I could have convinced myself that I was powerless, that one person couldn't challenge a system protected by wealth and political connections. I could have focused on my own comfort and my children's privilege, ignoring the other children who were dying for our lifestyle. Many people in my position would have made that choice, and no one would have blamed them. Instead, I chose to document everything, to gather evidence methodically, to build alliances carefully, and to wait for the perfect moment to expose the why. Truth. I chose to believe that justice was possible, even when it seemed impossible. You might be in a situation right now where you see something wrong but feel powerless to change it. Maybe it's workplace corruption that seems too big to challenge. Maybe it's abuse happening in your community that everyone knows about but no one discusses. Maybe it's a family member whose behavior you know is harmful but feel unable to confront. I want you to know that change is possible. Documentation is powerful. Truth has a way of emerging when people are brave enough to preserve it and share it. You don't need to be an undercover federal investigator to make a difference. You just need to decide that protecting the innocent is worth more than protecting your own comfort. The children who died because of Whitmore's greed can never be brought back. Marcus Chen will never grow up, never graduate, never have children of his own. But thousands of other children are alive. Today, because someone chose to act when action seemed impossible, Hunter thought that slapping me would silence me forever. Instead, it became the sound of justice finally arriving. Sometimes the moment when evil thinks it has won is actually the moment when good people decide they've had enough. Your moment might be coming. When it does, remember that courage isn't the absence of fear. Courage is deciding that some things are more important than being afraid. Whitmore Empire that had taken 4 generations to build had been dismantled in a single morning. The family that had treated children's lives as disposable research materials would now face the consequences of 90 years of systematic murder. Justice had finally arrived for Marcus Chen and the thousands of children who had died for Whitmore's profits. The system that had protected their killers had become the instrument of their destruction, and the woman they had tried to silence had become the voice that brought them down. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.